employability, and the presentations will be in the order that they're listed. Dr. Jeff Noonen, and Laura Zeitlin, Dr. Antoinette McCain, and Afsana Habib.
Oh, very good.
And your colleague. And my Jordy, also alternate roots, interventions editor, and take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jordy. Thanks to the organizers for having us here. Mireille and I wrote this paper together, so I'm going to talk about the first part, and then I'm going to turn things over to Mireille. Just to provide a little bit of context about the paper we're going to give. I'm a professor at the University of Windsor. Mireille is an adult educator at Catholic Adult High School in Windsor, and this paper comes out of a joint project we did, which Mireille will actually talk about. But it's an attempt, I suppose, to explore schools, educational institutions as contradictory spaces. But towards the end of the first session that was in here, I think it was James Cairns mentioned the problem of the institution of the school, whether these institutions should be abandoned and new institutions rebuilt, or whether we can work within them. And our paper speaks to that, I think, in a very central way. From our perspective, secondary schools and universities are contradictory. On the one hand, they attempt to impose a certain discipline on people. Insofar as they are schools, they attempt to impose or to get students to internalize the ruling value system. And if you look at the handout I sent around, I'm not going to read the paper, it's too long, so I'll just work through some of these points. You know, the quotation from Erich Fromm makes the first point I want to make quite clearly, right? He says, and this is going back to 1969, but you could go back even further, as some of James Turk's quotations showed this morning. Right? The social function of schools is to qualify the individual to function in the role he is to play later on in society, to mold his character in such a way that his desires coincide with the necessities of his social order. And Ivan Illich makes a similar point in his famous Deschooling Society. It's the next quotation. He says, schools pre-alienate the young. Right? School makes alienation preparatory for life. School prepares for the alienating institutionalization of life by teaching the need to be taught. Once this lesson is learned, people close themselves off to the surprises life offers when it is not predetermined by institutional deformation. Now, we agree with this critique of schools. We believe that schools are in fact alienating. They do serve to produce the sorts of people who desire only what the given society can satisfy. We see neoliberal educational reforms in this light as an attempt to subordinate what we call the educational function of schools, to which I'll return in a moment, to their schooling function. And we see their schooling function at this point in history primarily as the production of people not so much who are employable, because that's a function of labor markets, but produce people who conceive of their own good, their own meaning, their own purpose in life in finding employment and reinventing themselves when labor markets demand something else. Right? That's the disempowering effect of the schooling institution, to produce people who desire to be objects of labor markets and then to seek their fulfillment by purchasing goods, services, products, canned experiences in commodity markets. So that's the schooling function. That's the connective tissue that links what's going on in the high schools, which Mireille will talk about, to what's going on in the universities that I will talk about. Right? The rhetoric is that we are meeting student needs by preparing them for a real world that requires constant reinvention. Actually, there's a nice quotation from Alan Sears somewhere on the page. Did I quote Alan? Yeah, ultimately the goal of this transformation is a university system that, along with certain skills and knowledge, teaches students you are entitled to nothing. You have no right to anything you cannot afford, and you will only be able to afford things through a life of constant hustle. That's from a little piece that was up on the bullet a couple months ago, Austerity Youth. And that's a lesson that, in fact, as Mireille is going to show, it's a lesson that begins even earlier than the secondary schools. It's now kind of, it's being taught even imposed, instilled, even in the elementary schools. As you'll note, though, really it's a lesson about expectations. It's not about forming people with the skills or capacities or whatever you want to say that make them employable. Right? No one can predict with any certainty 5, 10 years down the road what labor markets are going to be buying. Right? So what this is really about is forming people who desire to be objects of processes over which they have no control, and I think crucially over which they want no control because they become incapacitated at an intellectual level from asserting their own individual and collective subjectivity. Now, if that's all schools were, then I think they should be abolished. But it's not all they are. Schools, perhaps more than any other institution in this society, are contradictory because even the schooling function requires the development of very basic but very important intellectual capacities. Take the capacity to read. If you learn to read, no one can control what you read. Maybe you read Harry Potter, maybe you read Trotsky. Who can say? Reading is emancipatory by its very nature because it opens you to a world which you then can decide how to explore. So the schooling function of institutions cannot be accomplished without, at least to some extent, educating people. Now we define education, and here I will read just because I want to make this point as clear as I can. We define education as a process whereby the cognitive and imaginative capacities of human beings are developed beyond their given range and depth, free from subservience to the ruling value system, for the sake of enabling comprehensive understanding of what there is to be known. Education thus enables the free development of cognitive and imaginative capacities, free from programmed service to ruling value systems, and free to think for oneself in continually expanding scope and critical depth of understanding. Once education has drawn out the latent imaginative and cognitive capacities of the human brain, the subsequent development of those capacities can no longer, in principle, be programmed by institutional authority. Take the phrase to think it over. Right? If you think something over, you are aware of there being a difference between the forces of natural and social reality and the cognitive systems by which you understand that. So to think it over implies a distance and a freedom from the object. Right? The educational role of schools develops freedom in relation to the objects of thought. And if you are conscious of that freedom in relation to the objects of thought, you're not being programmed by it. Now, that's dangerous. Because if you're not programmed by the object of thought, if you're the type of person who can think it over and talk it over with others, perhaps you begin to discover tensions and contradictions in the social field in which you exist. And if you discover those contradictions, then further thinking brings you towards structural problems. And then people perhaps begin to talk about solutions that go beyond the given structures. So we think that fighting within and preserving the educational function of schools is vital. It's vital for educators, it's vital for students, and it's vital for the general public. So we don't think the schools should be abandoned by any means. They are a terrain of struggle. We need to preserve and reclaim time and space and resources for that educational function. But we're up against very difficult, very determined enemies of the educational function. Right? As people always have been. This is a much longer struggle. Neoliberalism is one way of managing capitalism. It's not capitalism. It's not a social system. I think it's important that we remember that. Right? Alan's book, Retooling the Mind Factory, gives us a nice history. There's been all kinds of, there's been a fight over schools since there have been schools, because everyone has to go through them, or most people have to go through them. So that's the first point. We have to preserve and expand the educational function of schools, of education against their schooling function. In terms of the universities, and here I'll be brief because lots of people in the first session talked about the quote-unquote reforms happening in the universities, but I've never found it, repetition is always important, always useful. The universities seem to be under a twofold assault. The first assault is by way of starving them of public funds, and that in a macro sense, right? If you look at the CIUT Almanac over the last couple of years, you'll see a graph that goes down and down and down, and that's public funding for university operating revenues. And you'll see another line that goes up and up and up, and that's private sources, including mostly student tuition. So that creates an economic squeeze on the institutions that then forces all sorts of internal institutional changes, right? We see the growth of administrations. We see the conscious break, even at a rhetorical level, with the collegial self-governance that James Turk was talking about this morning. That's been dispensed with by and large in favor of the rhetoric of management. This goes hand in hand with what's sometimes called the audit culture, what I call the cult of quantification, right? That we need some, and apologies to the social scientists in the room who do good social science for a living. I'm not against compiling statistics in the abstract, but they can be disciplinary. They can be a tool of management. You have to be very careful about this. So I'm thinking here of learning outcomes and different things, different benchmarks, all of which really mitigate against the freedom of inquiry and the idea that a good education is something that opens you up towards freedom of thinking about the different objects of thought you'll encounter in your life as something which has material effects and can be specified in terms of a whole life, but which are perhaps not reducible to specific metrics that people are forced to develop because of government and administrative pressure. This changes the nature of teaching work decisively. I think it tends to operate on the basis of a contrived opposition between the interests of faculty and students. This is always sold in terms of student interests, meeting student needs, educators as not serious about their role as teachers, as lazy people who will shirk their responsibilities to their students if they're given the opportunity. So this comes with tighter disciplinary measures, attacks on unions, attacks on labor rights, etc., and so forth. It also has obvious impacts on the research mission of academic life, more pressure towards commodification, more internalized quasi-markets so people can fight over little bits of money that essentially control the research agenda. All of these are kind of decisive challenges that we face in the university. Nevertheless, right, the university remains a space where education can happen. And because it remains a space where education can happen, it remains a space where broader sorts of political and social resistance and transformation can develop. Right? But we think, and this is the second part of the paper, I'm going to turn things over to Mireille in a second, right? That in a period such as we are, where in Canada overt and large-scale forms of struggle and resistance are latent at this point, working with whomever there is to work with, whenever there's an opportunity to work with them, remains very important, right? Mireille and I not only have jobs as a professor and as an adult educator, we've been involved in various popular education projects in Windsor. That's where we met once. I organized a series of discussions called Philosophy for Workers. That's where we met. That's where all this work comes from. So we think we need to work outside of institutionalized spaces as well, obviously, but not vacate these institutionalized spaces to neoliberal forces, ruling class forces, especially in the case of JK to grade 12 education, where the law mandates kids go. Why would you see that type of institutional space to the right wing? but universities as well, even though there's all kinds of problems that need to be addressed. So the second part of the paper is going to concern what's going on in the secondary schools, and then describe a project that we jointly engaged in one of Mireille's classes that kind of magically broke people's consciousness free from that type of self-objectification that I was talking about earlier.
Hello, my name is Mireille Coral, and I'm a teacher in Windsor. I teach adults at the local adult high school. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the secondary school reforms that took place under Mike Harris, and those have been largely documented and publicized, so I won't go into them in any great detail. But Jeff and I wanted to talk about employability as an educational outcome. And in the neoliberal scheme of things, of course, employability generally means human capital. Human capital serves a political function, of course, that of reproducing neoliberalism, where an individual acquires knowledge, which that person owns independently and then uses to have a place in the labor market, reproduces neoliberalism, obviously. But it also transforms education as Jeff and I are defining it, and as Jeff has just described. Education no longer is seen as a venue through which we can discuss the common good, or matters pertaining to the common good, or social justice, that type of thing. But it increasingly, under human capital policies, is perceived as a place where, in the words of Paul Bouchard, it becomes the key to the ticket, the key to the meal ticket of the country, namely its economy. And we see this as problematic for education as we've been describing it. And this socialization does begin very early, at least under the Mike Harris years. We see even at the elementary level curriculum guidelines that list, for example, skills that can be applied in the workplace, even at the elementary level. And of course the standardized testing that we see in grades 3, 6, 9, and 10. And although the next government reinstated many of the massive funding cuts that were implemented under the Harris government, they retained employability as an educational outcome, as an important educational outcome, in fact. The ministry document that outlines the guidelines for assessment and reporting called Growing Success, in fact, references the Conference Board of Canada. The Conference Board of Canada's ideal outcomes for students graduating from the education system of Ontario, what makes for ideal workers, for example. The Conference Board of Canada and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The partner website, or the website that kind of is a partner to the document, Ontario Skills Passport, also outlines all the skills that will be necessary for young people graduating in an interconnected global economy, and how they should be competitive, and so on and so forth. Jeff and I live in Windsor, which is a city that is seeing firsthand the ravages, let's say, of neoliberalism, largely through the process of deindustrialization, which we see so typical of neoliberalism, and the massive unemployment that accrues from that, or that results from that. And I teach unschooled adults who are coming back to high school in order to earn a high school diploma in order to have a place in the labor force. And Jeff and I saw this as particularly problematic, that the very people whose lives are being, we're asking people to come back to school to participate in a process that reproduces the very forces that are wreaking such painful havoc in their lives. We thought that was insulting and problematic. And so what we did instead was we envisioned the classroom as a place where, not where we would make employable people, but where we could discuss what was happening to the city of Windsor and to their lives. And we began by giving it a name, neoliberalism. And so we encourage students to engage in a conversation among adults. I should say that under Mike Harris, funding for adult education was cut by 70%. the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation estimates that adult high school classrooms were reduced by something like 85% in the years after Mike Harris was elected. And students who were, or people who were injured or, sought adult education, went to private schools like the Toronto School of Business and so on and so forth. So what we did was we encouraged students to engage in a conversation about what was happening to the city, and what happened was we wrote a book. I say I have 1 minute left. We wrote a book, and the book took on a life of its own, where students talked about the forces that were happening. We asked students to make connections between their unemployment, free trade agreements, their inability to access social services, cuts to tax cuts, the neoliberal mantra, less government is better, and the long lineups at the emergency wards. And what happened was students came away, they wrote a book which they illustrated, they really took on, it became a collective action, which was the major project for the assignment, for the course. And I'll just finish with how this book came to be, what the students wrote. This book, the students wrote this. This book was created to voice the opinions of the students of the Canadian Politics and Citizenship class of St. Michael's Adult High School. We hope that by telling the truth about the phenomenon of neoliberalism, we will make a difference. We want to inspire people to embrace their dignity, pride, and self-worth. We also want to encourage people to have hope. So did our students become more employable? I have no idea. Did they become reflective, critical citizens of Ontario? Did they have a fulfilling experience in school? I would say that absolutely, yes, they did. Sorry.